Greetings. I'm Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal. I come to you from the old Capitol building here in the state of Washington in downtown Olympia. And this is really about part 6 of a long series of really powerful impacts that we've identified to improve student learning across the state of Washington. Our innovation series is meant to highlight where the state ought to be in the next 10 or 20 years if we're going to keep our competitive edge in great and excellent schools. Today, we focus a lot on what it means to have really impactful educational leaders in front of kids, classroom teachers, paraeducators, building administrators, and more. This proposal today reflects a lot of hard work from a task force who spent some serious time at the request of the legislature, thinking about the resources it will take to continue to invest in our educators so that we retain them, that we recruit them, retain them, and obviously have additional success. The school district funding model, as many people know, is not simple in our state, but what it really does boil down to is a certain level of investment that the legislature makes based on what we call a prototypical school model. For every certain number of kids, you get a certain number of teachers, librarians, counselors, building administrators, custodians, and more. So we don't attempt to change significantly in the recommendations today that prototypical model, although we have already proposed big concepts that would do that. Today really focuses on the compensation necessary to retain excellent educators. I'll also remind everyone that no matter what happens in our legislature, absent legal change, when they make appropriations for compensation, it is bargained locally, and we do not make recommendations to change that. Local education associations, partnering with their administrations locally, finding those solutions that meet the community best is what we retain in this, though there is always conversation in the legislature on how to do that more effectively, perhaps with a better eye to limited resources, especially at the local level. In many districts, the funding provided by the state is not adequate to fund the current basic ed model. We've talked a lot about this, and I want to reiterate a huge thank you to our House and Senate members of our legislature in all 4 of the legislative caucuses, Democrats and Republicans in both the House and Senate. They made enormous progress 4 years ago funding what is now known as the McCleary decision. Our court, our state Supreme Court, required our legislature to step up, create a more obvious and visible funding model for our schools, and then stick to it. Don't deteriorate over time. I cannot say enough that these are the moments historically in the state of Washington where those commitments have backslid. We enter periods of economic challenge, perhaps even a full recession. Those have historically been the times when our legislature has said, we don't have the resources, so we're going to pull back the state investment. We're going to ask local school districts to raise more local money. I want to urge everyone in the legislature, families who watch this, students, parents, educators, we cannot go backwards. This proposal today makes an explicit attempt to tell the legislature now is the time to invest more in educators, not less, even as we face difficult economic times. That said, in other proposals, we have solutions for one of our biggest dilemmas, and I want to be candid about that. Today, when the legislature provides investment, additional compensation, they do so only for the positions that the legislature funds. When our local communities have made the sacrifice to invest in more teachers, more librarians, more paraeducators, more mental health specialists, and a host of other positions, those don't get funded the same way by the legislature. In fact, there's no funding that goes to them. So our proposals in total, I do want to open up with continue to focus on ways the legislature can invest in supporting students with disabilities, for example, or transportation, or a host of other places where school districts are still using their local levies to fund what we believe is basic education. These things in combination make for a very successful session this next year when the legislature comes to town. If they will invest in the basics and continue to invest in our educators, it will free up local levy dollars for our districts to use those funds to keep locally funded educators on pace with their peers that are funded by the state. Let's get into it a little bit. We've got some background. We've got a little bit of data that I think will be important here. Today, quite frankly, we'll spend a little more time on the front end with the proposal itself and then talk a little bit about our why. What do we see that tells us this is an important time to do this work? I said before, there was a work group assigned to OSPI from the legislature. They actually made this commitment to the state courts. They said every 4 or 5 years, they will review the progress of their compensation investments and make any tweaks necessary or even substantial changes where appropriate. That assignment came to us. We had a very important work group who came together. They spent the better part of a year, maybe more, on this question. They delivered a long set of recommendations to us. We have grabbed a subset of those that we think is the appropriate bite in the first 2 years, the first biennial cycle. We can certainly talk about the additional enhancements recommended by the task force on an ongoing basis, but given where we are in the state today, the significant expectation we have for the legislature to fund inflationary increases for our staff, we've picked a set of recommendations from the task force that build upon inflation and take us to the next level on compensation. Our proposal is comprehensive. You'll hear about that. And certainly there are those who will have other ideas, and we certainly encourage those both now before the legislative session begins. And of course, once the session starts, there will be lots of folks who have impact on recommendations that might alter these. So we are all ears and eyes, but here is OSPI's recommendation as we said. Across the nation, there's been a significant impact on educators. Much of this is the result of the pandemic, but for years we have seen higher education produce fewer and fewer teachers across the country. It's not unique to our state. We see significant shortages, for example, when we attempt to hire educators who focus their passion on students with disabilities. We see it in other parts of our education system as well. Thankfully, we are not in the same desperate position that other states are. We have clearly invested in the last 5 years, significant growth in compensation, additional positions. This state has made that bipartisan commitment, and yet we find ourselves at a very, very difficult spot. Our proposals to include a one-time $10,000 hiring bonus for special education teachers who are providing services to our students with disabilities, a $5,000 one-time bonus for any staff, administrative and educator staff who are designated in high poverty schools. The research we'll get into a little bit, it is awfully clear the highest turnover in our state tends to be in communities where our students need the most supports. And we attempt to make a first ever investment in bonuses that retain educators, get them in the door and keep them in those schools. The stability that we can provide through this approach is both innovative and very powerful for the learning of our young people. We've said before and reiterate here that we are seeking a permanent annual bonus for educators and paraeducators who serve our students in dual language programs. I can talk all day about this. You've heard our innovation around this. We have moved from 50 locations to 100. We've tripled the number of students in dual language programs. The fate of Washington's economic success rests in our ability to educate our children in high quality public schools and give them something they've never had. Including access to the global labor market. That starts with dual language and multilingualism. And we think to do that well, we'll have to invest in educators so they continue to say, I want to teach in Washington State. In the absence of getting that talent in the door, our dreams of multilingualism for all of our students will be capped a little bit. It will take longer. The legislature made enormous progress in funding inflation over the last couple of years, and we know that that's pinching workers across the state everywhere, not just in public education. But our expectation is the legislature will continue to follow the law that they wrote. The law says that they will fund inflationary increases for our school districts. And what we would suggest on top of that is a 6% increase in baseline salary for all school employees. So the inflationary factor established by law, as well as an additional 6%, and we'll talk a little bit about why we have done that to address some inequalities across the state. If we don't make the inflationary adjustments necessary, we will find ourselves once more with educators who are losing ground to private sector and other public sector opportunities. When you think of a really passionate young person who's got skill in math or science or wants to work with students with disabilities or as a specialist in any way, these educators have choices and these young people have choices. And if we want them to be teachers and put their talent in the most fundamental thing that underwrites all of our economy, we're going to have to compete with some folks who can pay pretty impressive salaries at this point in time. So we don't want to lose any income. Our proposal is to not only add this 6% baseline, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but to move the inflation factor the legislature uses from what's called the implicit price deflator, IPD, to the CPI, Consumer Price Index. CPI is more realistic for what people are facing in their lives in terms of financial impact due to the inflation across the whole set of goods, including housing and other factors. It's not a major change in the short term, but longer term, it will keep our educators more competitive. We know that the regionalization approach the legislature took 4 years ago, this was the idea that housing costs more in some areas, so they put a premium in budgets in those districts that live in higher cost areas. It was a really important step for keeping folks engaged in their communities with the ability to live in the community in which they work. I think the task force did an excellent job suggesting that maybe that differential is too large. You have some districts who get zero regionalization, others who get 18% or more. You've essentially created a 20% differential from, sometimes communities that are very, very close to each other. That's unfair. School districts are then competing for talent based purely on the legislative funding model, and our hope is to fix that. We still use home value as the driving force. Our proposal, though, lies within the concept that entire counties get a regionalization factor and not one school district at a time. That way we get rid of the little islands that were created where their neighbors are all getting some additional help, but one school district or maybe two, they're getting nothing or significantly less than their peers. The other big opportunity here, of course, is to reduce turnover. Moving rapidly between districts, as educators, like any professions will do for opportunities economically, is not the stability our students need. And it's not the environment in which administrators in our schools can maintain that stable workforce for the success of young people. So we take a more holistic approach, and I want to round it out here a little bit on this regionalization idea. By lifting the baseline 6% across the state for every district, we then put a 12% maximum regionalization factor in place instead of 18%. Immediately, you get a baseline increase across the state, and the differential between districts shrinks. So you don't have as much of this concept of neighboring districts with significant disparities and educators having to decide whether they're going to jump over the border of a district in order to have their family maintain economic viability. This is complicated, but we do have additional detail that we can share. It's on our website. We've shared it with the governor's office through our request, and certainly with policymakers. We have maps. Everyone needs maps to see how different this is. You'll note that when we display this more visibly for everyone, you'll see that large regions now form more consistent with the true cost of housing instead of, again, this district by district approach. Experience factor was another really powerful force in our state for many, many years. Districts who hired very senior staff, those with lots of experience, had confidence historically that the legislature's salary model would follow. As they hired people, the dollars would follow. That went away 4 years ago. The legislature picks a flat amount of money per educator when they fund schools, and instantly they created what I believe is a pretty difficult precedent of school districts forced to hire younger educators, newer educators, and sometimes less experienced educators just in order to balance their budgets instead of seeking the best talent that they can find in their community. This approach here today makes a change. The legislature said in order to get some experience bump, some additional compensation to 4%, your district needs to be above average in the experience level of your teachers and above average in the number of advanced degrees that your staff holds. I'm super proud of our state. We have what I believe is nearly 3/4 of all of our certificated teachers with advanced degrees or higher. This is a state that's very serious about its teachers being of the highest quality. Our proposal simply changes the and to an or. To get the experience factor, school districts need only have a staff that is significantly higher in experience or has significantly higher advanced degrees. This honors young people who come into our system as well, who start off with master's degrees or higher when they teach in the state of Washington. With this proposal, currently 56 districts qualify. This will move it to 214 districts who will qualify for the 4% experience factor. The data, as I said, follows. Retention is powerful. We know how to achieve this through compensation models and supports. We'll talk a little bit about that. We know we can reduce issues of student discipline and disparate discipline approaches. The overall culture of schools, the accumulated knowledge, the stability of the workforce, that ability to do long-term planning and data walks with staff. The continuity of that excellence occurs when you have a stable workforce in a building, let alone in a school district. That's what this is all about today. And you've obviously seen us show you some detail here. We're going to get into more of it. Turnover is very expensive. Ask any public or private sector employer, and they will tell you that when you turn over employees, it is more than just losing time. There's a whole training component to it. Oftentimes, these are annual contracts that need some sort of buyout clause. This state would be well served to figure out where our highest areas of turnover are and invest important resources in those communities. And that's what we have attempted to do here. The evidence is quite clear. The higher poverty your school, we put these into 4 quartiles, the more turnover you have. Even reducing that by 1 or 2% in some buildings as a teacher or 2, and in larger buildings that can be 3 or 4 or 5 educators. That stability matters a ton in the way a school walks through its strategic plan and its site-based goals. We are proposing a $5,000 one-time bonus, as I said, for certificated and administrative employees who are hired to serve in high poverty schools. So this isn't money that goes to every district, and it isn't even money that goes to everyone in a district. It is all about the school you are in, with this, again, attempt to drive dollars where it is needed the most. In our state, we have made important progress on the diversity of our educators. Part of what we observe is that the entire world is beginning to understand, if they have not long understood, the really powerful outcomes for kids when our educators begin to reflect who they are by race, by gender, by other forms of diversity. We've been making great progress in this state, but you can see our student population is diversified a lot in the last 10 years or so. Our educators have not quite caught up, but that number was significantly higher in terms of white educators. Fortunately, we're seeing some great progress. If you look at newer teachers, those who have been hired in the last 5 years or so, you see that not just the long-term trend of 14% of our educators being staff of color, but now we're at 22, 23%. And if we had shown you a 1-year chart, those hired in the last year, you would see that approaching 30% or so. We are diversifying our workforce. This has been a lot of hard work from districts around the state, our partners at the Professional Educator Standards Board, our partners at the State Board of Education, our colleges and universities. We know by research our students succeed when classrooms reflect who they are. We're making progress on that. But these bonuses we're talking about, the investment in high poverty communities, the ability to retain these educators when we get them, this is the next wave of excellence in our state. The other opportunity, of course, is our ability to think about what it means to be an experienced educator. If anyone's ever taught before, the first year is brutal. You don't remember it because of the trauma that comes with trying to be all things and do all things and get familiar with your material. But when we keep educators on for 2 years, 3 years, or beyond, they're much more likely to stay in the profession and, of course, stay in their location, which means a ton to us. Beyond the direct compensation and bonuses for educators, we do have an approach where we want to invest dollars in what we call the BEST program, Beginning Educator Support Team. This is where educators get direct mentorship. We want that to last longer in their careers, beyond a year or more. We want more educators, including school counselors and building level administrators, to get that level of mentorship. Again, when they feel supported in the job, they stay, and that is good for our students. We also have a teacher residency program proposal that we continue to advocate for. We've got some great partners in this work. I want you to imagine needing a surgery and being confident that the doctor who's going to provide that surgery not only has years of experience, but when they were practicing to become a doctor, got a paid residency of duration. So they were working with experienced doctors, experienced surgeons to truly understand how to do the work well. That's what teachers need. Today, we ask them to go into student teaching experiences, often for a semester or less. It is unpaid. They are strapped financially. They're still paying tuition back at their host institutions. Perhaps they're paying a second rent at the location they've been assigned to. They don't always get the real experience necessary. And of course, at such short duration, they don't get the benefit of that master teacher, mentor teacher there. So we do have a proposal to move our state forward into a true residency concept where we will treat our professional educators the way we would dentists and doctors and so many other professions in this state and in this country. I want to close before we take any questions, and we may not have any today, but I do want to say very clearly here, there is nothing more important to the success of young people than our ability as school leaders at the state and local level, especially the local level, to connect with families and to connect with that student. To do that well, you need the best professionals in the world. I am so grateful when we get folks from industry who teach, but even those folks would tell you the challenge of education isn't knowing their content necessarily, math, science, health, PE. It's their ability to know child development, and it's their understanding of how kids move through the educational system and making those connections with them. It's relationship building. So to every single educator who is stuck with us for the last couple of years, and we did have a wave of retirements bigger than normal, thank you. Thank you for being teachers, paraeducators, bus drivers, custodians, administrators. Everything we do to create the system of excellence for our schools, and we are on the road to recovery in awesome ways: attendance, enrollments, assessment scores. We are having great success once more. It is because of the professionals who stay with the system and who choose this system. So thank you if you're already in it. If you're a young person thinking about teaching, do it. Be a part of this thing. We are going to continue to invest in ways we have never seen in this state. We've already demonstrated with the legislature the excellence of their investments. They have taken enormous courage to invest in our public school educators. We're asking them to take the next step. 20 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to say this moment post-pandemic, this time when historically the state would have taken a step backwards, is this the time they take a step forward? More investment in our educators, more supports for students with disabilities, more ability for students to learn languages, more connections to work. All of the things we put forward in our innovations is about using the moment we've been in, capturing the innovations that we've seen, and then making those permanent so that we have a system, again, 2 decades from now, where people look back and say, that was a state who invested when it got hardest. And that's what we're all about. So thank you very much for being a part of this. Our website will have all of the comprehensive data, both our budget requests and any policy consistent with this proposal. Again, educators, thank you. We believe in you. We know you're the difference makers, and our proposals to add a hefty $1.4 billion more per year, growing, in addition to what the legislature is already obligated to do by law. Katie, are there any questions?
No questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Again, this is part 6. You can see all the other innovations that we've launched. We're very excited about the work and all of the coalitions that we're building around the state. If you're interested in being a part of any of those, from dual language to dual credit to students working while they're in high school and getting credit to investing in our educators and more, reach out to OSPI, reach out to your school district, ask them how they're making this come to life in their own way. We're happy to partner with anyone who wants to keep pushing this system way beyond what we thought we could do. That's what our students deserve.